because I've asked Diana to address with us what the left is doing, what you might call the red in the red-green axis, that is putting freedom at risk, putting it at risk in many places around the world, but also here at home. So without further ado, Diana Wells, welcome. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Frank, for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here and speaking about this extremely urgent question, whither freedom? And in trying to address it, I decided that in order to really address where freedom is going, we do need to know where freedom has been. We have to know whither freedom was, in other words. In other words, I would like to inject some historical perspective, because what we're actually living through daily is a very curious iteration of our past that I do believe is mainly lost to us, is lost to our collective understanding. And to bring that into focus, I would like to quote the late great American journalist M. Stanton Evans, very appropriately here at CPAC, which was, in fact, he is considered a founding father of CPAC. He was chairman of the American Conservative Union in the 1970s. So this is very much his stomping ground. And Stan was, in addition to being a great journalist and a great anti-communist, he was also a historian, but not the PhD kind. He was the kind he was really more of the shoe leather detective back in the archive kind of historian. He did not accept the conventional wisdom. He went back and found out what really happened. And one thing, I got to know Stan in the couple of last few years of his life. And one thing he said in appraising modern American history, which is, again, so appropriate to our modern moment, this would be the history of World War II and the Cold War, he said, and I was actually quite shocked to hear it, to tell you the truth, he said, the more I've delved into these matters over the years, the more I realize that the history we've been given, the conventional history, the establishment history, the consensus, whatever you want to call it, is pretty much bogus. This is a lot of history he's talking about. Now, I do happen to agree, but it was very confirming and validating to hear it with someone of his experience. He talked about how much of what is out there is this amalgam of court history to, in other words, enshrine the victors. A lot of it's disinformation, and it is the disinformation that's embedded that's so dangerous, he said. And he said, I am reminded of what Mary McCarthy said about Lillian Hellman, the notorious Stalin apologist. She said, every word she writes is a lie, including and the. It's a big moment. And Stan said, that's a pretty good description of a lot of what passes for history. That's what's so important to bear in mind today. And he also said that this is where we understand the methods by which our government was taken into camp, so to speak, by its own adversaries, by our country's adversaries, and policies were perverted to support the interests of the Soviet Union. Now, flip this just a little bit and try to address yourself to whatever the headline in the Washington Post will be tomorrow. This is something to keep at the back of our heads. It's very difficult for us to sort through these threats to freedom, we're talking about whither freedom, if we don't understand the past. Now, what we're looking at is obsessive focus on Russian collusion of the Trump campaign to the exclusion of any other campaign, any other party, Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton campaign. This becomes a useless exercise, and it also connects again to this idea that we don't have continuity with our past and we don't understand the past. So if we are making judgments about Russia and interference in our electoral system and all the rest of it, and we have no concept of the past, we are not going to make good judgments. And I realized that I wanted to bring this book of Stan Evans to CPAC. This is blacklisted by history. This is his reappraisal, his revision of Joseph McCarthy, Senator Joseph McCarthy. And what he did with this book is he went back to the original archives, the commentators of the time, the politicians of the time. He was able to use released FBI documents that were released 40 years after they were created. He was able to also use executive sessions from Congress to write this book. And of course, some of the archives the CIA sifted through perhaps, but released, the government release is known as Venona, and some other archival materials out of Moscow to write such a book. It upends the narrative. It switches everything. And I do urge people to read this. This is the model, really, of how to do it. And in fact, I used this as a model to write my own book, American Betrayal, that Frank mentioned. Stan Evans, in a sense, pioneered this technique with one man, Joseph McCarthy. It took this much, it's about 700 pages, to do it. I was able to build on that and broaden out to decades of infiltration and subversion, the Roosevelt years, the war years, the Cold War years. There is so much more to be done that I invite everyone to jump in, because this is a big project to overturn this bogus history. And I will say that one thing Stan said that I do cherish is he said, "You were the reader I was waiting for." And what he meant by that was to take this model, and I was able to use it in my own research, and I'm continuing to use it. This becomes so important because we cannot understand this deception today unless we start flipping it again. And this is the point I would like to address with people in terms of wither freedom today and how to save it. This is a switch. This is the ultimate switch for modern Americans. If Joseph McCarthy is not the demon of the demon child of American history, and is in fact the hero of American history, then everything we've been taught is wrong. The whole way we look at this notion of subversion, this notion of domestic networks working to subvert us under the Kremlin guidance and the rest, is wrong. And that is huge. But we are living through switch after switch after switch, and they're intensifying, which is very sinister to me. It's not just fake news that we're looking at. And I would just draw your attention to this new paradigm that has been evolving since Donald Trump provoked it. We would not be seeing that if he had not run for president. This is the paradigm that says that the left, Barack Obama, starting toward the end of his second term, Barack Obama nurtured by the scions of the communist network, etc., Hillary Clinton, the pacifist left, the pro-Soviet left going back in the day, they are the new Cold Warriors. And the right, particularly the MAGA, America First, sovereignty-supporting voters for Donald Trump, who promised repeatedly that he wanted to expand America's nuclear arsenal. We are now the Russian stooges. We're the Russian agents, and I think this is how we have to address the Mueller indictments. Mueller indicted 13 Russians last week in Russia, no hope of prosecution. A political document, yes, and people say, oh, fake news, and so on. Look what CNN did with that. Look what the New York Times is doing with that. They are targeting regular, ordinary Americans and trying to say they're the next Alger Hiss, essentially. Not that they know who Alger Hiss is. But this is how it's weaponized. This is how the paradigm is being shifted. This is where the threat to our liberty is, because it's very hard to see through these things and understand them. And even the indictment itself is a switch. And here's what I mean by that. When Mueller was FBI director in 2010, the FBI rolled up a decade-long counterintelligence operation known as Ghost Stories. If you remember, it was about a dozen Soviet operatives of the SVR, supported working moles, trying to get into the power circles, the policymaking circles, and indeed they were. In fact, it was rolled up because the counterintelligence chief at the time said they were getting too close to a sitting cabinet official. Well, that was Hillary Clinton. And what did Robert Mueller do? He sat by as the administration sent them home. No indictment or comparable measure under counterintelligence situation. They didn't try to turn them. They didn't try to certainly debrief them, which you would think. They didn't even get a good trade. This was inconvenient to allow the Obama administration to be exposed to actual Russian influence, a political effort. Flash forward to 2018, and we see almost the mirror image. 13 Russians in Russia, no hope of indictment, no hope of prosecution. A political move to concoct this kind of Russian interference, collusion, dirtying up people as a political weapon. Always serving politics, never the national interest. And this is sort of the kind of switches that we need to become very, very aware of, very serious and sinister, and I can see them being used in ways that will be very ugly in the future. So read up, study up, and start looking for switches because they're all around us.
Diana West, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Obviously, this is just a sample of the extraordinary information that Diana has at her fingertips, and I commend to you both her book and Stan Evans, and also the opportunity to visit with her separately. Her blog site is terrific. It is dianawest.net, and it's required reading.